So if we're talking about sustainability, I think the keys to being sustainable, that word is just too loaded. I know a lot of people don't like the word sustainable because people make it mean other things, lots of different things. Sustainable could be environmentally minimalism. It could be trying to reduce the, to maximize economic profit. What kind of sustainability do you really mean? And so I'm going to try to just avoid the word, even though I have it in the title of the slides today, and really just kind of take a BMP's approach. So best management practices for an above average lawn. If these are the tips, if you do these right, we can have a pretty good lawn that, you will still be an envy of your neighborhood, but not need a lot of inputs that really aren't necessary in most cases. I'll be honest with you, and I'm going to brag a little bit. I'm in a neighborhood association where people spend a lot of money on having people take care of their lawns. I take care of my lawn. I put barely anything into it, and I honestly believe I have one of the best lawns in the neighborhood. And part of that is just knowing what to look for, but I don't focus that much on it. I'm a turf professor. I don't really love to go home and take care of my own lawn. I do this all day long. That's the last thing I want to do, right? And so I just try to, do these 5 things, and by doing these 5 things, I can have a really, really nice lawn that I think is one of the best in the neighborhood. And so I kind of want to just, bring some of these ideas to you tonight. So one of the first things I did when I got to Nebraska and I wanted to take care of, improve my lawn, was I wanted to make sure I planted the correct grass. And so in Nebraska, we're mostly cool season turf grasses. And of the lawn types that I would recommend, we have Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue are pretty much the predominant grasses in eastern Nebraska. Some people do plant perennial ryegrass, and it's not really my favorite grass because it takes a lot of inputs to make it look good. It's something we see on golf course fairways, sometimes in the eastern part of the state, sometimes for athletic fields, but from a home lawn, it's not really, kind of what I would recommend planting. So those are the ones we like for cool season grasses. Or cool season meaning they like to grow when it's cooler outside, because of how their physiology works. We also have our warm season grass exception. I'm sure many of you have heard of buffalo grass, and the cool thing about buffalo grass is it's native. It is a native turf grass. It is the only native turf grass to North America, and we live in a place where we can grow it. It's a creeping type grass. That means it will grow and spread over time. But because it's warm season, it's going to be managed different than if it's cool season. So we'll kind of get into what that really means. So Kentucky bluegrass is something I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. It's fine leaf textured. It's kind of got a mid to dark green color. A lot of the newer cultivars out there have very, very dark green color versus the older ones have more of a light, green color to them. That's important because if you have an older lawn and you go buy some sod and it's bluegrass sod, you want to make sure that it's got a color similar to your lawn. Otherwise, it's going to look silly because you'll have these areas that are just, dark green around a whole lawn that's lighter green. Doesn't matter if you fertilize it. It just, you can't keep those areas looking good together. A nice thing about Kentucky bluegrass is it spreads by these lateral stems in the ground. They're called rhizomes. And so it can recover from traffic. And, I have big Great Danes, and they run through the backyard, and, they rip it up, and then the rhizomes fill it back in. So that's really nice. It has a pretty average root system and a fairly average water use requirement for most of our turf grasses. But its real benefit is it can go dormant during drought. And so that's why we really like this grass from central Nebraska into western Nebraska, because when we have those dry periods, then this grass can kind of just say, I'm calling quits for now. I'm going to store my energy in my crowns, and I'm going to regrow from my rhizomes once the weather returns. This is kind of an interesting demonstration to show the differences in the bluegrasses and how they have different fertility requirements. So this is a common Kentucky bluegrass. It's called Ken Blue, and it's older. It's from, I think it's from like the late 70s, early 80s. You can see it doesn't have a very, very green color. And in this example, it's either fertilized 0 times a year, 2 times a year in this strip or 4 times a year in this strip. And you'll notice there's some dandelions here where there's 0 amount and 0 times a year applications. Over here we have 2 times a year, and there's a couple dandelions. 4 times a year, though, there's a few dandelions there still, but not terrible. And these are never treated with any kind of pre-emergent or post-emergent herbicides for a couple of years. And so you can see just by the nature of this cultivar that it's got decent color and decent density, and it's doing a pretty good job keeping the weeds out at bay. This is an example, though, of some of the newer bluegrasses that are out there. And so you can really see the dramatic difference between how they respond to fertilizer. This app over on the side here, 0 pounds of fertilizer, there's not much grass left. A lot of these newer varieties need a lot more fertilizer, need good fertile soil to perform well. 2 apps a year, there's some dandelions. 4 apps a year, look at there's like 3, 4, 5 dandelions in this whole area. And so it really does show that at first picture and expectations where the neighbor might think, well, my neighbor next door's got 1 million dandelions, and so that's the reason I have dandelions. That's not always the case, because the only difference here is just fertilizer. And you can have this or you can have that. And so it's pretty marked. If you still have some kind of bad weed infestation, you just can't blame your neighbors. You gotta look in the mirror and figure out, what am I doing to maybe improve my lawn? And if you have a newer variety that has this really dark green color, it might need a little bit more fertilizer than those older varieties of bluegrass. All right. Turf-top tall fescues, dark green color, but they have a coarser leaf texture. It means the leaves are a little bit wider. If you look at them closely, you'll see a lot of veins going on. Instead of one mid-rib in a bluegrass where you have this one big vein in the center, these are going to have multiple veins across the leaf. Nice thing about tall fescue, very heat tolerant for the cool season grasses, so we'll see this go farther and further south. Very deep rooting, but highest water use. And so that's kind of interesting. A lot of times people will plant tall fescue because it has better water, better short-term drought tolerance. It accomplishes that by having a nice deep root system, so it can scavenge more of the soil for water. But it actually uses water faster than any other turfgrass. And so it's a kind of compensating for that high water use for this big root system. We have one of those years like 2012, however, where we don't get any rain. Even if you got 3 feet of roots, that soil's dry all 3 feet. That grass is using a lot of water. It doesn't have a strong dormancy response, and so it can start to die. And if you look at a lot of the athletic fields around the schools in eastern Nebraska that weren't maintained well during that drought, there's not much tall fescue left because it might have been good at first, and then that drought came in and wiped it out. So it's great for areas with temporary drought. So eastern Nebraska is really, really well suited for the tall fescues. Some of these tall fescues, too, have gotten really, really fine leaves. And so we're actually working with a company now that thinks that you can even mow these new tall fescues as low as fairway height, 1/2 inch, and still have good density. So it's pretty exciting because we do have a grass that is pretty low maintenance and might have more applications going further in the western part of the country. Further north, we're finding it's getting better and better cold tolerance, and these finer leaves are allowing it to really blend in with the bluegrasses. It is a bunch type of grass, though, so if it does die in a big patch, we're not going to see that much fill. Even the RTFs and things you might hear advertised, you might get 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch spread off of a clump of tillers, but it's not going to be like bluegrass where you can have rhizomes running 1 foot or 2 to fill in an area. And so here's kind of an example of the different grasses. So we have 4 applications of fertilizer, 0 and 2 applications of fertilizer a year. You can see a little bit of a green color here, but again, even the 0 pounds of fertilizer looks pretty darn good. Look at relative in the background. You can see there's a lot of dandelion pressure and just good maintenance with good watering and mowing, and decent soils allowing this 0 pound fertilizer app to still keep those dandelions out. Perennial ryegrass, again, I don't really like ryegrass. It's very popular for athletic fields. It has a very fine leaf. It's very shiny leaf. The reason it's used a lot is it's very quick to establish. Problem is, it's also quick to die. So you get in this never-ending cycle where you put down some perennial ryegrass, it pops up real quick, and cold comes, heat comes, disease comes, kills it all off, and then you end up with this mess. So if you're thinking about reseeding, it's not a bad idea to have a little bit of ryegrass in the mix, 10% or so, if you're doing bluegrass or tall fescue. And I wouldn't even recommend it for tall fescue, because tall fescue germinates pretty much the same speed as ryegrass. But if you got a bluegrass loam, bluegrass takes a long time when you seed to kind of get it up and going. So you can put some perennial ryegrass in with that mix. That helps that bluegrass kind of be a nurse crop to let those little seedlings get going. Then the stress comes, the ryegrass dies, the bluegrass fills in, and everything is fine and dandy. So that's perennial ryegrass for you. Again, here's that example. Even 4 pounds of fertilizer, yeah, it's a little bit cleaner than the 0 pounds, but still looks pretty bad. And about a month after this whole thing was annihilated with disease and looked absolutely terrible. And so then finally, we have our friend buffalo grass. Again, it's our native. It does have a light green color, and it's a warm season grass. And so it wants to grow when it's warm. It's going to be a little bit slower to break dormancy, generally by a week or two. Not a huge change. And it will go dormant a couple of weeks before the cool season grasses stop growing. The advantage of it being a warm season grass is it's deep rooting and low water use. And so we can get away with a lot less water and see buffalo grass thrive. And so that's why we'll see it into the shortgrass prairies of western Nebraska and into Wyoming and all the way up into Canada and all the way down into Texas. It really does cover the full Great Plains. It is a low maintenance grass. It is not no maintenance. And that's a big issue with this. A lot of times you think, I got this no maintenance grass, I'm going to throw it down, I can set it and forget it. No, especially in your first year. Your first year, when I have buffalo grass, I baby it pretty much like I'm babying a cool season grass. Once I have a nice, dense stand of buffalo with no real weeds, then I can start cutting it way back and letting it just, find itself. But it's not no maintenance. It is a low maintenance. You still want to fertilize maybe once a year versus, 2 to 4 times a year for a cool season grass, and it's going to use about 40% less water. And it's only going to use less water if you give it less water. If you give it all the water that you think a cool season grass needs, it's going to use it. If it's got free water, it's going to use it. But it's when you start to dry it down, then it's going to really thrive. So here's an example of it thriving in Arizona. You can look around at how dry that soil is. You can see how that buffalo grass is doing a really nice job of keeping its color. So it really kind of shows the advantage of this grass. This is a linear irrigation gradient where along this black line here, it's getting 100% water replacement. And the further away you get from the line, there's a reduction in how much water the turf's getting. Buffalo grass, looking strong. The bluegrass, not doing as well. It gets about halfway out, and we're seeing drought. And then at the end, it's all dead and, just decaying away. Sometimes, though, again, I'm not a grass advocate. If this is your growing environment, this is not where you put grass. This is where you put mulch. This is where you put stones to walk on. And so you have to realize that grasses like pretty full sun. They like air movement. Think about where they're from, right? They're not from an area like this. This is pretty much similar to a forest canopy. And you're trying to grow grass in here, it's going to fail. I mean, you wouldn't put a full sun flower into, moderate to heavy shade and be upset if it didn't flower, right? I mean, we have to think of our grass like you think of every other plant in your landscape. They have to have particular places. If you can't grow tall fescue, which is one of the more resilient grasses, in a spot like this, you can't grow grass here. I'm sorry. So just stop trying and try to look for something else. Maybe it's a ground cover, maybe it's a mulch, something else that's going to hold the soil. Because the more important thing is, if the grass isn't going to hold the soil, you get those big rainfall events, that soil moves, that soil goes off your property, goes into storm drains, it goes into drainage ditches, goes into our rivers and our lakes and causes the algae blooms. So the important thing here is keeping the soil contained somehow. And if grass isn't getting the job done, then you got to find something else to get that job done. So let's go back to questions. Any specific questions? Let's see if I can get this to pop back up. Here we go. Chat. All right. So back for this ad for no mold lawn seed. It was described as fescue including creeping fescues. What's your opinion? Said mow 1 to 2 times a year at 2 to 4 inches, and does that work? And not in Nebraska. The fine leaf fescues, like the creeping fescue, the creeping red, the chewings, the sheep fescues, they do not like the heat here. Think about where they came from. Those plants, their native range, their center of origin is the British Isles. A place that doesn't get very hot. It's very wet all the time, but also well-draining soils. They don't like to have their feet wet, and so we put them in Nebraska where we have heavy soils, and then it gets really hot, big rainfalls, and then temporary drought. Diseases wipe them out, and they don't really persist much at all. And so, we're seeing more and more people trying to make no-mow lawns. There's actually a bluegrass that seems to be potentially okay at this, it growing pretty slowly. We have a lot of bluegrasses we call low-mow blues. And they have nice, good color. They don't grow at all, really. I mean, you might mow them a few times a year, and that's going to be a better mix than some of these grasses containing, these fine leaf fescues. The problem with them is they're very slow to green up. They may not green up until July, honestly. And so we'll see athletic fields put in these low-mow blues because they look nice. And then they'll play spring baseball on them, and those get beat up pretty bad because they just don't grow at all. So, any other questions all about particular grasses for Nebraska? Okay. I know one thing people always try to ask is, what's the best cultivar of grass? Should I go to, a home center? Should I go to a nursery? Those places are. Carrie wants me to talk about zoysia. But where should you get your seed from? It's really hard even for me to keep up with the grasses because companies are always coming out with new ones. And honestly, we have a bunch of lawn grass seed suppliers in this state that's kind of what they do all the time is look at what are the newest cultivars, which one works the best in our climate. And so finding those type of people that sell just grass seed, contact them. They can sell small batches. So I went to a guy in Omaha who just sells grass seed. I mean, and he sells it to the golf courses and everything else. So what's the best for you got right now? He says this is what it is. And so I planted a variety that worked really, really well, and in Nebraska, based on the current research and relying on the expertise of someone that is kind of their life. So one question we have is, how do we tell the difference between old types and new types of bluegrass? And that's, again, part of this issue. There's research now where they're trying to separate what type of grass it is. The thing I look for is ask what type of grass is this, bluegrass is it? If they say it's a compact or a midnight, those are some of the newer types of bluegrasses, and they grow really, really slow versus some of the older, we generally just kind of group together as commons. But again, someone that specializes in grass seed will be able to tell you if it's an old or a new, and it's something that you're really going to want to ask a professional when picking what plant you're going to use. Terry asked me about zoysia. So zoysia is kind of funny. I'm sure many of you know that rock does not like zoysia on Backyard Farmer. And one of the reasons is because zoysia doesn't survive our winters all the time. And so what happens is part of it dies, and then the bluegrass or the tall fescue starts to get in there, and it looks bad. And then in the summertime, the zoysia can creep into your neighbor's yard and not look very nice. And things we're noticing is actually zoysia is slowly marching further north as we're getting more and more varieties that are more cold hardy. And we have new herbicides that we can use to help keep the cool season grasses out of the warm season grasses. So that is really kind of expanding the potential use of zoysia grass. So I wouldn't still go to the Sunday paper and get the amazing zoysia grass that you'd see, but some of the newer cultivars do have some promise, and so we're kind of interested to kind of track that. I'm not recommending zoysia yet in Nebraska, but it's not, it wouldn't be unheard of, especially right around the Kansas border, to think about zoysia, because you go into Kansas, there's a lot of zoysia. So as you're crossing that miracle line, and all of a sudden we're not supposed to be planting zoysia anymore, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. But again, I think we're trying to get our heads around, how safe, how long-term of a solution is it in Nebraska. A couple other questions we had here. What about crested wheatgrass and other types of wheatgrasses as turfs? Keenan Adamson, our buffalo grass breeder, is looking at all different types of native grasses, like the wheatgrasses. One that's got really strong potential, salt grasses, especially further west. They seem to be looking pretty good, especially in roadsides. Another grass that we like is blue grama. Blue grama and buffalo grass are always found together in the short grass prairies. The problem with these newer varieties is there's not much breeding done for them yet, and so we're looking. They're not going to have the same quality as some of the more bred varieties are going to be, but I think we're going to see that change over time.